Silence is often mistaken for weakness, surrender, or emotional exhaustion. Yet in some relationships, silence becomes the most powerful message ever delivered. It arrives without warning. No final argument, no dramatic goodbye, no desperate attempt to be understood one last time. Just a sudden absence where emotional effort once existed. This is the moment many people fail to understand, especially avoidants. Most people assume that when an empath finally goes silent, the avoidant gets exactly what they always wanted. No more emotional conversations, no more requests for connection, no more pressure to open up, no more expectations. Freedom at last. But psychology reveals a far more complicated story. In many cases, the silence that initially feels like relief slowly becomes a source of confusion, discomfort, and emotional collapse. The very distance that once felt safe begins to create questions that cannot be ignored. The mind starts replaying old conversations. Memories become louder. Regrets become harder to escape. And the person who seemed so certain about needing space suddenly finds themselves facing emotions they spent years avoiding. The relationship between an empath and an avoidant often follows a predictable cycle. One person reaches for connection while the other retreats from it. One person wants understanding while the other protects themselves through distance. The empath continues giving, continues hoping, continues believing that patience and love will eventually break down the walls. The avoidant continues pulling away whenever emotions become too intense. This pattern can continue for months or even years. Then a turning point arrives. The empath stops chasing, stops explaining, stops proving their worth, stops trying to rescue a connection that only one person is fighting to keep alive. What happens next is rarely discussed. Most people focus on the pain of the empath. Very few explore what begins happening inside the avoidant when the emotional safety net disappears. That hidden psychological process is where this story becomes truly fascinating. In this video, we are going to uncover why avoidants often struggle after pushing an empath into silence, why the loss of emotional pursuit can feel more unsettling than constant attention, how silence forces buried emotions to rise to the surface, and why many avoidants do not recognize the true value of the empath until that connection is no longer available. We will also explore lesser-known psychological dynamics that explain why this shift can completely change the emotional balance of the relationship. By the end of this video, you will understand why silence is not always the end of a story. Sometimes it is the beginning of a psychological awakening that neither person expected. Stay with us until the end because the final reason may be the most powerful of all. And it explains why many avoidants are forced to confront truths they spent years trying to escape. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy exploring human behavior, attachment psychology, relationships, and the hidden forces that shape our decisions, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community. Now, let's begin. One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidant behavior is the belief that avoidants never depend on anyone emotionally. From the outside, they often appear independent, self-sufficient, and comfortable with distance. They may rarely express emotional needs. They may avoid vulnerable conversations. They may even act as though relationships are optional rather than important. Because of this, many people assume that an avoidant loses very little when someone leaves. But beneath the surface, the reality is often much more complicated. Even though avoidants tend to resist emotional closeness, they can still become deeply accustomed to certain people being present in their lives. Over time, the empath often becomes one of those people, not because the avoidant openly admits their dependence, but because the empath creates a form of emotional stability that slowly becomes part of the avoidant's normal world. For a long time, the empath is usually the one holding the connection together. When communication breaks down, the empath starts the conversation. When conflict creates distance, the empath reaches out. When misunderstandings occur, the empath tries to repair them. Even after painful arguments, the empath often returns with understanding, patience, and another attempt to reconnect. This repeated pattern creates something many avoidants do not consciously recognize. It creates certainty. Deep down, they begin expecting the relationship to survive almost anything. They begin expecting the empath to come back, not because they necessarily take pleasure in hurting the empath, but because the pattern becomes familiar. The empath leaves temporarily, becomes hurt, needs space, then eventually returns. The cycle repeats so many times that it starts feeling permanent. The avoidant may not think about this consciously. They may never say it out loud. Yet their actions often reveal an unspoken assumption. The connection will still be there tomorrow. The empath will still care tomorrow. The relationship can be revisited later. Difficult conversations can be postponed. Emotional responsibility can be delayed. Vulnerability can wait for another day. Time seems unlimited because the empath has repeatedly demonstrated loyalty, patience, and emotional endurance. What makes this dynamic powerful is that the empath often provides reassurance even when receiving very little in return. The empath becomes the person who tries to understand instead of judge, the person who searches for explanations behind behavior, the person who sees wounds where others see flaws. While many people would walk away after repeated emotional distance, the empath often stays. They continue offering understanding long after most people would have given up. In many cases, the avoidant becomes used to this level of acceptance without fully appreciating how rare it actually is. Then everything changes. The empath becomes tired. Not angry, not dramatic, not interested in proving a point, simply tired. The constant emotional effort begins to feel one-sided. The repeated disappointments begin to accumulate. The endless waiting starts draining energy instead of creating hope. Eventually, a moment arrives when the empath no longer feels motivated to keep carrying the relationship alone. There is no grand announcement, no emotional speech, no final attempt to be understood. There is only silence. For the avoidant, this silence often feels different from previous periods of distance. At first, they may not notice. Life continues normally. Their routine remains unchanged. There are no messages demanding answers, no emotional discussions requiring attention, no pressure to engage, no expectations waiting to be fulfilled. For someone who often feels overwhelmed by emotional intensity, this can initially feel like relief. The emotional pressure disappears. The relationship becomes quiet. The demands of connection seem to fade away. For a brief period, the avoidant may feel lighter. They may feel as though a burden has been removed. The absence of emotional responsibility creates a sense of freedom. The nervous system relaxes. The relationship no longer requires immediate attention. Distance feels comfortable because distance has always felt familiar. This reaction often confuses people. Many expect avoidance to instantly regret losing someone important. Many expect immediate sadness, immediate panic, immediate realization. But psychology rarely works that way. The first emotional response is often relief because the avoidant's deepest fear is frequently connected to emotional pressure, obligation, or feeling trapped. When that pressure disappears, relief naturally follows. Yet relief is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning. As days turn into weeks, something subtle starts happening. The silence remains. The empath does not return. No message appears. No attempt to reconnect arrives. No emotional conversation begins. The familiar pattern suddenly breaks. The avoidant slowly realizes that this situation feels different from previous conflicts. The silence is no longer temporary. It no longer feels like a pause between chapters. Instead, it begins feeling like the chapter itself may be ending. That realization introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty affects avoidance in ways many people fail to understand. Avoidants often prefer emotional distance because distance feels predictable. They control how much they share. They control how close someone gets. They control when they engage and when they withdraw. This sense of control helps them feel safe. But when the empath truly goes silent, that control starts disappearing. The avoidant can no longer predict the future of the connection. They do not know what the empath is thinking. They do not know what the empath is feeling. They do not know whether the relationship still exists emotionally. The certainty that once existed begins to crumble. Questions start appearing. Questions that cannot be answered easily. What if they are really gone? What if they stopped waiting? What if they finally accepted that nothing will change? What if someone else enters their life? What if there is no opportunity to return later? For perhaps the first time, the avoidant begins facing a reality they spent years avoiding. Relationships are not permanent simply because they have always been there before. People can reach limits. Patience can run out. Emotional investment can fade when it is not reciprocated. The absence of the empath starts creating a psychological vacuum, and human beings naturally notice what is missing. Small memories begin surfacing unexpectedly. Conversations replay inside the mind. Shared experiences return without invitation. Moments that once seemed ordinary suddenly feel meaningful. The avoidant may try distracting themselves through work, hobbies, social activities, or other relationships. Yet the unanswered questions remain. This is where uncertainty slowly replaces relief. The distance that once felt comfortable begins feeling different, not because the avoidant suddenly transforms into a completely different person, but because the meaning of the distance changes. Distance chosen by the avoidant feels safe. Distance chosen by someone else feels unpredictable. And unpredictability often creates anxiety. The empath is no longer emotionally available on demand. The connection is no longer sitting quietly in the background waiting to be reactivated whenever convenient. Instead, it exists beyond the avoidant's control. That shift can be surprisingly unsettling. As the silence continues, another process begins unfolding beneath the surface. Without realizing it, many avoidants spend years focusing on external situations rather than internal emotions. When emotional conversations occur, attention often shifts toward the other person's reactions. During conflict, attention focuses on managing discomfort. During arguments, attention focuses on creating distance. During emotional discussions, attention focuses on escaping pressure. The empath's constant presence unintentionally provides a distraction. There is always another conversation, another issue, another misunderstanding, another emotional exchange. But once the empath disappears, that distraction disappears too. The silence creates empty space, and empty space can become uncomfortable. There are no arguments to analyze, no texts to ignore, no explanations to resist, no emotional demands requiring immediate action. There is only stillness. And within that stillness, the avoidant becomes increasingly aware of their own thoughts. Thoughts that were easy to ignore suddenly become difficult to escape. Memories grow louder. Regrets become clearer. Questions become more persistent. Many avoidants have spent years protecting themselves from emotional discomfort. This protection is rarely intentional. It often develops as a survival strategy. Vulnerability felt unsafe. Dependence felt risky. Emotional exposure felt dangerous. Over time, emotional avoidance became automatic. Yet silence removes many of the usual escape routes. Without constant interaction, suppressed emotions begin surfacing. Sadness appears unexpectedly. Longing emerges without warning. Guilt starts developing. Curiosity grows stronger. The avoidant may not immediately understand these emotions. In fact, they may struggle to identify exactly what they are feeling. They simply notice an increasing sense of discomfort that cannot be solved through distance alone. For perhaps the first time in a long time, they are forced to sit with themselves. And that can be one of the most challenging experiences for an avoidant. At the same time, another realization often starts taking shape. The empath was not merely another relationship. The empath was often one of the few people willing to see beyond the avoidant's defenses. Many people become frustrated with avoidant behavior quickly. Many people stop trying to understand. Many people leave after repeated emotional unavailability. But empaths tend to approach relationships differently. Instead of focusing only on behavior, they often search for the pain beneath the behavior. Instead of immediately judging withdrawal, they ask what caused it. Instead of responding with rejection, they respond with curiosity. This level of understanding is extremely rare. The empath often gives chances that other people would never give. Second chances, third chances, fifth chances, 10th chances, not because they enjoy suffering, but because they genuinely believe people can heal, grow, and change. For a long time, the avoidant may underestimate the value of this acceptance. It becomes familiar, it becomes expected, it becomes part of daily life. Only after the empath emotionally leaves does the true value become visible. The avoidant begins comparing new interactions to the old connection. Other people may not be as patient. Other people may not be as forgiving. Other people may not spend hours trying to understand hidden emotions. Other people may not remain loyal through repeated periods of distance. Slowly, the avoidant starts recognizing what the empath actually provided, not perfection. Not endless happiness, not a flawless relationship. Something much rarer, understanding, acceptance. Emotional persistence, a willingness to see the person beneath the protective walls. And once that realization begins taking shape, the silence starts carrying a completely different meaning. One of the biggest myths about avoidance is the belief that if they are hurting, everyone will know it. Many people expect emotional pain to look obvious. They expect late-night phone calls, emotional confessions, dramatic attempts to reconnect, or visible signs of heartbreak. They assume that if an avoidant truly misses someone, they will eventually show it in a clear and undeniable way. But avoidant psychology often works very differently. In many cases, the deepest struggles happen completely out of sight. The collapse is not always dramatic. It is not always loud. It is not always visible to friends, family, or even the empath who walked away. In fact, some avoidants appear perfectly normal while going through one of the most emotionally confusing periods of their lives. From the outside, they may continue going to work. They may continue socializing. They may continue posting on social media. They may continue following their routines exactly as they always have. To everyone around them, nothing seems different. This is why many empaths become convinced that the avoidant never cared. They look at the avoidant's behavior and assume there is no emotional impact. They assume the silence changed nothing. But internal emotional experiences are not always reflected in external behavior. Some people process pain by expressing it. Others process pain by containing it. Avoidants often belong to the second group. As the weeks pass, the mind begins doing something it was never forced to do while the relationship was active. It begins revisiting memories, not once, not twice, over and over again. Conversations that seemed unimportant suddenly return. Specific moments replay repeatedly. Certain words become impossible to forget. The avoidant may find themselves thinking about situations they dismissed months earlier. They may begin analyzing arguments from a completely different perspective. They may start wondering whether the empath was trying to communicate something they failed to understand at the time. This mental replaying can become exhausting because there is no longer an active relationship creating distractions. There are no new conversations replacing old ones. There are no ongoing conflicts demanding attention. The silence creates room for reflection, and reflection often reveals things that were previously ignored. At first, the avoidant may try pushing these thoughts away. They may distract themselves with work. They may focus on responsibilities. They may throw themselves into hobbies or social activities. Yet certain thoughts continue returning. The brain naturally searches for unfinished emotional experiences. It searches for answers. It searches for meaning. The empath's absence creates questions that remain unresolved. Regret often begins entering the picture during this stage. Not always overwhelming regret. Not necessarily regret that appears all at once. Sometimes it arrives in small moments. A memory surfaces. A realization follows. The avoidant remembers a conversation where the empath was asking for understanding. They remember a moment when vulnerability was offered and not received. They remember an opportunity to be honest that was avoided. Slowly, they begin seeing the relationship from a wider perspective. This can create a confusing emotional state because avoidants are often not accustomed to sitting with regret for long periods of time. Their instinct has frequently been to move away from discomfort rather than move toward it. Yet silence removes many of the usual escape routes. The relationship is no longer active. There is nothing left to avoid. There is only the emotional reality that remains. Confusion becomes another common experience. Part of the avoidant may still believe distance is what they wanted. Another part may feel unsettled by the consequences of that distance. They may struggle to understand why they keep thinking about someone they worked so hard to push away. They may question why memories keep resurfacing. They may feel emotionally numb one day and unexpectedly emotional the next. This emotional inconsistency can be difficult to understand. One morning they feel completely detached. By evening they feel unexpectedly reflective. A week later they convince themselves they have moved on. Then a simple reminder brings everything back again. The emotional experience becomes unpredictable. Many avoidants also experience a form of emotional numbness during this period. Instead of feeling sadness directly, they may feel disconnected from their emotions altogether. This numbness is often misunderstood. People assume numbness means the absence of feeling. In reality, numbness can sometimes be a protective response to feelings that are difficult to process. The emotions exist beneath the surface, but access to them feels blocked. Because of this, the avoidant may struggle to understand what is happening.